There's much more to say, but I now go straight to the colloquium. Dr. Tazuko van Berkel on Socratic economic theory.
Thank you, Don. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen right now. So does this look all right for everyone? I hope everyone managed to get a hold of the handouts. So I would like to start with a captatio benevolentiae, as is common. What I'm going to present represents, on the one hand, work in progress. So it is the groundwork for a new project I have recently received funding for. And on the other hand, it is also a revisiting and a reformulation of issues I have been thinking about for quite a while. So apologies to those of you who know my work on Socratic economics. A second preliminary point that I would like to make is that this project has emerged from various outreach activities that I have been conducting for the last couple of years with professionals in finance and laws, with employees of the Netherlands Court of Audit, and with high school students and refugees. So with these groups, I usually do not read out a paper or lecture, but I use more Socratic methods of confrontational dialectics. But today I will try to conform myself to a macrologia, to the format of this colloquium. So here comes a bit of traditional monologue. And I will start with a story from the 1930s. So in the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression, an era of pessimism, there is John Maynard Keynes, one of the founding fathers of modern macroeconomics, writing a futuristic essay that is remarkably optimistic in tone on the economic possibilities for our grandchildren. Now, to appreciate the optimism of this essay, it helps to be reminded of the scale of the crisis. So in terms of GDP drop, the Great Depression was 15 times worse than the Great Recession of 2008-2009. Now, in the midst of this era of pessimism, Keynes writes an essay, and the basic tenet of it is that the present crisis is only a momentary setback because technological progress will eventually compensate for this. What is more, it will actually solve the economic problem. And this is on the slide and also on your handout number 1A. In our own lifetimes, we may be able to perform all the operations of agriculture, mining, and manufacture with a quarter of the human effort to which we have been accustomed. In the long run, mankind is solving its economic problem. So the basic math is very simple. Technological progress results in productivity growth, which will eventually create an economy in which we all only have to work 15 hours a week. To Keynes, this is actually a mixed blessing. This is your handout 1B. So for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his real, his permanent problem: how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him to live wisely and agreeably and well. Keynes is actually making an analogy here with a phenomenon that he has observed in his own world. That is, upper-class housewives suffering from nervous breakdowns because they had too much time on their hands. Now, this is the predicament that Keynes anticipates for human being, a nervous breakdown on a global scale. But Keynes ends on an optimistic note, saying it opens up the possibility of benefit. Mankind may be able to adjust itself to this new way of life, a life that no longer revolves around toil and around satisfying the old Adam in us. Now, 90 years after this essay, it seems fair to evaluate the quality of this prediction, which is a popular game among economists in the past 2 decades. Was Keynes right? Well, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we have become 4 times as rich as we were in the 1930s. So globally, the gross domestic product per capita has gone up with about 400%. Actually, it is a bit of a coincidence that Keynes got this right, because he assumed no major wars and no population growth. But on the other hand, he underestimated productivity growth. So these two mistakes cancel each other out. But he was not right in the sense that we are nowhere near this 15-hour work week. Working hours may have diminished by 25% at most between the 1930s and the 1980s, but since the 1980s, they have gone up. And even when individual work weeks may have diminished, if we look at the level of a couple, of a married couple, for instance, work weeks actually have gone up again. So this prediction may not strike us as particularly accurate. Where did Keynes go wrong? This is the topic of How Much is Enough, a book co-authored by Robert and Edward Skidelsky, father and son. And in short, their argument is this: economic growth can be converted in either time, which means more leisure, or into consumption, which means more spending. Keynes assumed the first, but the second scenario happened. Since the 1980s, our consumption expenditure has massively increased. Now, how comes Keynes did not anticipate this? Part of the answer lies in Keynes's worldview, or more precisely, his take on economics. When Keynes predicts that the economic problem may be solved, the presupposition is that the economic problem is a problem of insufficient means for a finite amount of wants. In the end, a finite problem. Economics is defined in terms of material resources, in terms of the things that we need in order to survive and live a meaningful life. So food, clothes, shelter, education, maybe some music, maybe some other things, but in the end, a finite list. Finite lists can be checked off. Finite problems can be solved with increase of means, with productivity growth. However, around the same time, in the early 1930s, something revolutionary happens in the world of economics, the genesis of what has come to be our textbook definition of economics. This is your handout 2D. Economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. So to Keynes, the subject matter of economics was material welfare. To Lionel Robbins, it is scarcity. And it doesn't really matter scarcity of what. It may be scarcity of material resources, but the same logic maybe applies to love, attention, ideas, basically to everything. Scarcity is not substantially defined. We do not have to define our ends. So we may spend time on acquiring knowledge, if that is the end that we choose, by intensely studying Socrates would be a good means for that end, but this time also has an alternative use, because this is the tragedy of our existence. We can only use this time once. So we can, for instance, spend that time on strengthening meaningful ties of friendship. This is an alternative end, by hanging out, for instance, and having loads of beers in a pre-pandemic world. So the logic of the human condition demands choices, and economics studies human behavior in as far as it involves such choices. Now, this may look like only a textbook definition, but it does have some far-reaching consequences. First of all, the definition has shaped the discipline of economics as we know it today. If scarcity is an axiom, so if we always assume scarcity when we study human behavior, the economic problem is by its very definition indefinite. Because if the problem is scarcity, not enough, the solution will be always more. And more comes by different names in economic theory. So when we look at consumers' behavior, we talk about utility maximization. When we look at companies and firms, we look at profit. When we look at national economies, we look at growth. But the logic is always the same. Quantitative problems call for quantitative solutions. Furthermore, to Robbins, the ends by themselves are not interesting. So economic science becomes a method of decision for decision making. It becomes instrumental. That is, it explicitly and deliberately keeps itself from thinking about ends, about goals, about what we want. It restricts itself to the question, whatever it is we want, how do we get it? This has important implications for the development of economics as a science. In a sense, it liberates economics from morality, ethics, and theology. With Robinson's definition of the discipline, economics became free to develop itself as an instrumental science in which phenomena were measurable, quantifiable, and object of calculation and prediction. Economics does not have prescriptive pretensions anymore. It presents itself as descriptive, a science that studies human behavior. And the big question that fell off the agenda of economics is, how much is enough? This question is relegated to the individual consumer. You decide how much is enough. It is not an economic question anymore because economics treats what you want as a given. This is the so-called doctrine of the givenness of wants. But more importantly, this view of economics is not merely an academic phenomenon. It also affects our behavior, our thinking, because in our everyday life, we as normal people, as opposed to economists, operate with what I call a trickled down version of Robinson's definition, a folk economics. Because this definition of economics, even though it claims to be purely descriptive, is not value free. It's not a neutral tool to describe human behavior and to understand the world. It is a Trojan horse for a particular anthropology, a particular understanding of what defines us as human beings. And this definition is the very vehicle of the Homo economicus, the economic man, rational man, a characterization of mankind as atomistic and in the ultimate analysis, selfish, and rational in the very limited meaning of optimizing means with regards to ends. This is basically our modern self-portrait, and it deeply informs our self-understanding and our understanding of others. For instance, we tend to think that the only ways to influence the behavior of others is to either punish or reward them, that is, to appeal to their optimizing nature. And we also tend to dislike conversations about ends. When our fellow citizens question our self-chosen ends and ask us, well, do you really want this? Should you really have this drink? We feel that they are interfering with our freedom. They're being paternalistic, they're pampering, they're not liberal. So how much is enough is not an economic question. It becomes a purely individual lifestyle issue. Now, this self-portrait of mankind persists, even though we know from evolutionary biology, from social psychology, from cultural anthropology, that this Homo economicus is by no means a faithful portrait of human nature. Even economic theory has a revised and qualified portrait of human nature, especially in the more heterodox schools of economics, such as social economics, institutional economics, post-Keynesian economics. The Homo economicus has the status of a dead horse. But in our folk economics, or as Paul Krugman would say, airport economics, the kind of economic theory that you find in flashy paperbacks that you buy in airport bookstores, the image of the Homo economicus is so deeply ingrained in our policy making, in the way we think education works, in the way we approach ourselves and others, that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, we find this anthropology resonating in statements like this. Freedom is maximizing one's desires and pursuing all desires without restraint. Or self-control is voluntary self-enslavement. Now, these statements look like an apt summary of the worldview I have just been describing, a worldview in which consumption, the satisfaction of wants and desires, is the arena where we exercise our individual freedom, where there is no point in disputing what constitutes the summum bonum, whether the best relish is to be found in apples, plums, or nuts, to speak with John Locke, and where consumption is the only area in the economic cycle in which people are not supposed to be acting rationally, where there is no intrinsically desirable life, only a range of desired lifestyles. except that they are not modern statements. What they actually are paraphrases of Callicles' great speech in Plato's Gorgias, revealing a worldview that in some sense comes dangerously close to ours and that is diametrically opposed to everything that Plato's Socrates stands for. Callicles' position is that freedom is about maximizing one's desires and pursuing them. Any obstacle to that is an impediment of freedom, including self-imposed obstacles such as dull moral norms about self-restraint and justice. Nothing but morals for the weak. This is, by the way, a nice piece of genetic discourse, of genealogy of morals. So living by such norms amounts to voluntary self-enslavement. How to respond to such recalcitrance? As often, Plato's Socrates responds with storytelling. This is your handout to G, I suppose. In his parable of the leaky jars, Socrates compares the lives of two men, both equipped with a series of jars and engaged with the project of filling the vessels with precious fluids. The first man, having taken proper care of his jars, has a finite job. The second man, having neglected the containers in his quest for more content, has an infinite job filling his cracked jars. Every time he pours in wine, it leaks away. Now, which of the two, Socrates asks, is leading the better life? The question is meant to be rhetorical. To Socrates, freedom is the capacity to not pursue one's desires and to not be enslaved by them. To Callicles, this is leading the life of a stone, handout 2H. So no desire means being deprived of the sensation of satisfaction. Living life to the fullest means letting it flow. It is the hydraulics of pouring in as much as you can and letting it flow as much as you can too. The bigger the holes, the leakier, the better. To Socrates, Callicles is leading the life of the ΧΡΗ, a bird of messy habits and uncertain identity, to quote Dodd's memorable phrase, that apparently has the habit of excreting while eating. So two diametrically opposed anthropologies, both based on the conceptual metaphor of the human being as a container or a vessel. So human being as a hydraulic system with optimized influx and efflux versus human being as a closed jar. And also two diametrically opposed notions of freedom. Callicles' freedom is very close to ours. It is the freedom to pursue our self-chosen ends and to satisfy our desires. If we want to spend our hard-earned fortune on sex, drugs, and rock and roll, so be it. Nobody has the right to tell us what we want. Socrates' freedom is freedom from desires. It is the pursuit of desires that is slavery. Now, to my mind, this discussion between Socrates and Callicles goes to the heart of ancient Greek economic reflection. It questions the rationality of consumptions. It argues for a distinction between objective needs and subjective wants. It approaches abundance, not scarcity, as its central problem. And it stipulates a limit of wealth instead of propagating unlimited growth. Themes that are also treated in the economic works of Plato's contemporaries, Xenophon and Aristotle. Moreover, this discussion shows that economic theories always imply an anthropology, a particular view on human nature or on the human condition. Human beings are conceptualized as containers, hydraulic systems, as static stones, as hedonistic creatures or slaves of their desires, as coinciding with their pleasure-seeking bodies, or as subject to a body-soul dualism. And finally, the discussion shows an array of discursive practices used by the conversation partners to make their normative claims. Callicles grounds his hedonistic worldview in a genealogy of morals. Socrates uses an eschatological parable. None of these elements that I just listed are generally associated with economic theory. In modern mainstream economic theory, neoclassical economics, abundance and upper limits for wealth are not considered economic problems. The only relevant anthropology is the rational economic man, Homo economicus, and economic discourse is supposed to be descriptive discourse with a distinct quantitative rhetoric. Economic theory in this form did not exist in ancient Greece. My aspiration with my project is to offer a revisionist account of the ancient Greek history of economic reflection by asking three fundamental questions. First, what are the central concepts, questions, and principles that the ancient Greeks themselves thought were economic, meaning pertaining to the ways in which human beings interact with their natural and social environment for the provisioning of their livelihoods? What are the emic notions? What are the systemic contexts? Second question, who or what is the ancient Greek equivalent of economic man? What kind of anthropologies are implied and propagated by ancient Greek economic reflection? How do particular anthropologies inform and shape key economic concepts? And third question, what kind of knowledge is economic knowledge in the ancient world? What kind of discursive practices are producing, shaping, and reproducing ancient economic thought? And as of September the 1st this year, I will start working on this project with a PhD student and a postdoctoral student, and I'm super looking forward to it. But in the remainder of this paper, I will present a preliminary case study that is the discussion of the Socratic notions of use and utility. So what would be an emic definition of economics? A good candidate is, of course, found in the first chapter of Xenophon's Oeconomicus that revolves precisely around the definition of oikonomia. Interestingly, and as often has been pointed out in scholarly discussions, Critoboulos' first suggestion is that the goal of oikonomia is increasing the oikos. This is handout 4b. So this means growth. Socrates ignores the issue of growth, and incidentally, I think he never fully endorses it as an objective, but he does insist on a proper definition of oikos. The conversation moves through a couple of analytical steps, not all of them justified. So an oikos means contains everything that you own, that is your entire property, your kthesis, handout 4c. However, Socrates points out that you can also own or have enemies. This is perfectly idiomatic Greek. So would increasing the number of enemies also increase your oikos? Critoboulos now revises his definition. It's not about everything you own, but about anything good, agathon, that you possess. Real possessions, khramatha, are whatever is beneficial to someone. Handout 4d. Harmful things are liabilities, xemiai. Beneficial things are assets, khramatha. The discussion now moves from khramatha to khramatha assets. Assets, khramatha, literally actually usables, things that are useful, mean things that you can use, which in turn means things that you know how to use, handout 4e. So in other words, Socrates and Critoboulos, in their attempt to define possessions, khramatha, which is the realm of oikonomia, establish a criterion of value. Wealth, khramatha, is defined in terms of usefulness. You can buy a horse, but if you don't know how to ride it, that is, how to use it, you fall off it and harm yourself. The horse is of no use to you, it is not an asset to you, no khramatha. The same goes for land and livestock. If you don't know how to use them, they are not khramatha. Xenophon is actually a bit of a repetitive chap. So more examples follow. For instance, land and livestock. If you don't know how to use them, they are not khramatha. Handout 4f. Incidentally, they are not random. These are not random examples. So horses are, of course, markers of property. Property class, land is a marker of citizenship, and livestock is traditionally a measure of wealth. Perhaps the most evocative example to us would be the flute, or any musical instrument for that matter. It is an asset for someone who knows how to play it, but worthless for someone who does not. That is Khramatha are fundamentally subjective in the sense that they are defined relative to the subject's knowledge of their proper use. 4G on the handout. And here Critobulus does an interesting suggestion. What if you sell the flute and make money out of it? Wouldn't that make the flute an asset after all for the musically challenged among us? Now, this is where economic historians get excited, because here Xenophon seems to discover the distinction between use value and exchange value. This distinction, though akin to Aristotle's distinction between the value of a shoe as a shoe and the value of a shoe as an exchange object, technically finds its pedigree in Adam Smith and more systematically in Karl Marx's work. Use value refers to a product's utility in satisfying needs and wants as afforded by its physical properties. Exchange value is the quantitative relation as the proportion in which values and use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort. And Xenophon's Socrates briefly touches on such a distinction, only to immediately collapse it again. Selling can only make a flute into an asset if one knows how to sell, handout 4H, that is, how to acquire something in return for it that is an asset, Khramatha. Use value is the only true wealth. This has a very radical consequence. It means that even money, to argurium, the exchange medium par excellence, the quintessential exchange value, only counts as Khramatha if one knows how to use money. This must have had a paradoxical ring to it, because in Attic Greek, the Khramatha is of course the most idiomatic term for money. But even money, the prototypical asset, is not an asset if you don't know how to use it. If you use it to buy something that is bad for you, for instance, if you spend it on a hetaira or on some funky herbs like henbane. Now, this last point exposes the chasm between present day approaches to utility and wealth and the goal relative definition of Khramatha. Things have to be good and beneficial to be Khramatha. So take, for instance, the GDP, the gross domestic product, the metric that we use to measure economic growth. It measures the total aggregate of all products and services that are produced and exchanged. So all products and services, including henbane, or to take a somewhat more topical equivalent, cocaine. So if newspaper headlines go all excited about our national GDP growing up, if they yell economic growth by 3%, it could also mean that we all have become avid snorters of cocaine. This is good for the economy. Still, something remains unsettled in this goal-relative approach to Khramatha. What exactly is the goal? So Xenophon's notion of knowing how to use seems underanalyzed in the sense that the ends remain implicit. Proper use to what end? It implies knowing how to use it to your benefit, but the Oeconomicus does not seem to offer a coherent answer to the question what this benefit actually is. What is the long-term good in Xenophontic ethics? Excuse me. So Xenophon's subjective redefinition of Khramatha is generally recognized as part of a wider debate among the Socratic authors on the issue of proper use, of orte chresis. The usual suspects mentioned in this context are Plato's Euthydemus, the pseudo-Platonic Eryxias, and Aeschines' Callias. It seems tempting to speculate on the possible Socratic origins of the doctrine, and in addition, connections to the linguistic ideas of, for instance, Prodicus and Antisthenes have also been postulated. But how coherent is this doctrine? I will briefly review the arguments in the Euthydemus, the Eryxias, and the Callias, and the aim of the present analysis is a strictly comparative one, so I will not make any claims as to the chronology or the vexed question of the precise relation between these texts. So starting with the Euthydemus, features two elements reminiscent of Oeconomicus 1. Namely, the subject-dependent definition that a good can be used correctly and incorrectly, and the idea that correct use is premised on knowledge or wisdom on the part of the owner of a good. argument in Plato's Euthydemus starts from two inventories of good things, agata, on the one hand, wealth, health, good looks, and honor. On the other hand, virtues such as courage, sound-mindedness, justice, and wisdom. And the question is what good fortune consists in. The argument proceeds with the agreement that the possession of agata is a condition for happiness, but not a sufficient condition. So a couple of distinctions are being made. First of all, the distinction between possession and use. So in order for a good from the inventory to benefit us and to make us happy, we must not only possess it, but also use it. So this modifies the thesis into happiness consists in the possession and use of goods. And the distinction between possession and use seems to be a novel element here. It was implied in a Xenophontic discussion where we saw a shift from Khramatha to Khramatha, but there the shift remained underanalyzed. The next distinction is between correct and incorrect use. So using goods is not sufficient for benefit and happiness either, because they may be used correctly or incorrectly. Incorrect use is worse than no use at all, for incorrectly used goods can actually harm us. So this modifies the thesis into happiness depends on the possession and correct use of good things. Note that only Plato's Euthydemus features the actual collocation of orthos and chrestai. So in the Oeconomicus, good use is implied in the phrase knowing how to use something. In the Memorabilia, Xenophon occasionally speaks of eu chrestai or kalos chrestai, but never orthos. And similarly, Keynes speaks of eu or kakos chrestai. I'm not sure how significant this is, but it seems noteworthy given the ubiquitousness of the idea that there is such a thing as a Socratic doctrine of proper use, of orthe chresis. Third point, correct use depends on wisdom or knowledge. This modifies the thesis into happiness depends on the possession and wise use of good things. And then the argument moves to the point that wisdom or knowledge is the condition of the goodness of goods. Wisdom is the only thing good by itself, ignorance the only thing bad by itself. We have seen how Xenophon's notion of proper use remains underanalyzed. We never get a clear conception of the ends of proper use, nor what counts as correct use. Does the Euthydemus offer an articulate account of the ends of proper use? Although it is never made explicit in the Euthydemus what counts as the proper use of bodily and social goods, given that the argument in the Euthydemus seeks to establish how we become happy, correct use must mean beneficial use that contributes to the happiness of the possessor, of the owner. But as Gerasimos Santas points out, this only pushes back the question further, because what is the content of the wisdom necessary for correct use of the goods? Wisdom of what? Wisdom of how to use the goods so as to bring happiness to the possessor? Well, this ultimately requires knowledge of what happiness is, something that is not provided for in the Euthydemus. We do not get the type of answer as in the Protagoras where happiness equals pleasure and wisdom comes down to the wisdom of the sources of and means to pleasure. So where Xenophon Oeconomicus left us with a floating concept of use, in the Euthydemus we may have a floating concept of wisdom. In the pseudo-Platonic Eryxias, we see several Xenophontic themes recur. The subject-dependent valuation of wealth, so wealth defined in the conventional way is a good for those who know how to use it, but bad for those who do not. A normative redefinition of Khramatha, only those goods that are genuinely chresima, genuinely useful, are genuine Khramatha. The paradoxical and prototypical example of currency, so coinage is not Khramatha if it is not useful, and the idea that there is a relation between wealth and needs. In an embedded reported dialogue that Socrates recounts in the first half of the Eryxias, it is the sophist Prodicus who voices this subjective definition of wealth. when he says that property or that wealth, being rich, is bad for those. It's good for those who know in what situations they should use their property, but bad for those who are wicked and ignorant. So we recognize the subject-dependent valuation of wealth here. Being wealthy, here defined in the conventional way as the possession of many goods, is good for kalokagatoi and those who know how to use wealth, but bad for the mean and the ignorant. Note that strictly speaking, the formulation hopu dai chrestai points towards knowing in what situations one ought to use Khramatha. In the second half of the Eryxias, we move to the definition of Khramatha. The question, what are Khramatha, is instigated by Eryxias' commonplace conception of wealth. He thinks that wealth means that someone who owns many Khramatha is wealthy. And what follows is a breathtaking analysis of the relative value of property, unfortunately with no unambiguous answer as to what Khramatha are in the end, but some crucial observations. Only things that are useful, chresima, to the owner, can be counted as Khramatha, a notion very akin to Xenophon's definition of true Khramatha as things that one knows how to use, but the difference is nonetheless interesting. Xenophon does not use the adjective chresimos in the context of the Oeconomicus. He does use it in the Memorabilia to talk about the utility of people, of persons, mainly of philoi, friends. The first principle applies even to the paradoxical case of money. Coinage is not Khramatha if it is not useful, chresima. The specific example discussed here is Carthaginian coinage, described earlier as small leather pouches with irrelevant content. So for us, on the, yeah, this is for E on the handout. For us, so for conversation partners operating in an Athenian context, this leather coinage cannot count as Khramatha, for it fails to be chresima, useful. We cannot use it to obtain what we need. So this raises the question, useful for what use? Pros tina chreian. And the answer is that the end of it is the production and purchase of something that one needs, something that one daistai. This is a novel element, although the Oeconomicus thematizes both the concept of use and of needs. No systematic connection is forged between these notions. So here in the Eryxias, we see a direct link between utility, something being chresimos, and need, endeia. This, of course, raises the question, needs for what? The tentative answer offered in the Eryxias is for bodily needs, that is for maintaining life and health. But this is an answer that seems to be problematized in the rest of the argument. Moving on to point 7, if mankind could sustain life without money, money would not be Khramatha. But they are, in fact, Khramatha because they indirectly support life. And an last point that is observation that I would like to make is that certain skills with which one can earn money, which is needed for the purchase of provisions, are also Khramatha. So defining usefulness in terms of needs has an interesting implication. It leads to what Rainer Nicol has phrased as a zwec progressus ad infinitum. So everything can be useful in some sense for some end. Nothing is not useful. Even bad things and deeds can be related to a good end. The point is not further pursued by Socrates and Eryxias. It is only near the closing of the dialogue that we get an implicit solution to the infinite regress of utility. When the conversation partners move on to a different question, the question who should be considered happier, the person with many needs or the one with few, they agree that the person with the fewer needs is in the best psychic condition. Here, as in Xenophon and in Aristotle, a distinction is presupposed between natural needs, which justify the possession of goods, and other needs which should not be justified. And this effectively puts a normative hold to the infinite regress. Restriction of needs implies restriction of what counts as useful. This, of course, is reminiscent of the relative definition of being rich in Oeconomicus 1:2, where Socrates paradoxically claims that he is richer than Critobulus because his needs and desires are limited. But the tenet in the Eryxias is both more radical and more systematic. Here, being wealthy, in the conventional meaning of the word, is by definition harmful because of the tight connection between Khramatha, Khresima, and endeia. So between riches, usefulness, and needs. Having many Khramatha means that they are all useful, Khresima, which implies that you need them, so it implies many needs, which points to an unstable soul. So whereas in the Oeconomicus, the valuation of wealth is relative to the needs of the owner, so being rich is having an excess of goods over wants, the less you need, the richer you are with the same quantity of wealth. In the Eryxias, we see a wholesale condemnation of material wealth. The less you have, the less you apparently need. Aeschines' Socraticus makes the paradoxical twist to the idea of correct use of correct use of wealth. The correct use of poverty is even more admirable than the correct use of wealth. And the phrase using wealth well or ill, so eutekai kakos chromenus, implies that the true value of wealth depends on the use made of it by its owner. Genaios suggests that the right use of poverty, and by implication presumably also the use of wealth, is premised on moral character. Now, what emerges from this discussion is that there is a set of themes commonly associated with a Socratic doctrine of proper use. Many themes are shared across different dialogues, but we do not get one coherent doctrine. Rather, family resemblances between texts that offer paradoxical accounts of basic economic concepts, such as wealth, being rich, assets, and money, by insisting on the importance of use, proper use, and utility. So all lexemes with the ΧΡΗ root. The precise sets of statements differs per account. The accounts are geared towards the broader concerns of the text that they feature in. Now, in the following, I would like to address two remaining brief questions that may help us clarify, especially Xenophon's conception of proper use. The first is, to what extent is the Socratic notion of use commensurable with modern understandings of utility and use? And the second is, what is the significance of the language game, the etymological argument used to articulate the connections between wealth, assets, money, and use? Now, within the framework of modern market economic conceptualizations, useful applies to something that is a means to our independently defined ends, which is the realm of value, as opposed to an end in itself, the realm of values. Elizabeth Anderson, for instance, describes use as a lower, impersonal, and exclusive mode of valuation that sees things as fungible and capable of being traded with equanimity for any other commodity at some price. Therefore, in post-Enlightenment thinking, there is a strong moral impediment against framing interpersonal relationships, for instance, in terminology of use. Our fellow humans are inhabitants of the Kantian kingdom of ends. They ought to be valued as ends in themselves, as opposed to means to our ulterior ends. Hence the unease of some commentators with the Xenophontic notion of knowing how to use a person or friend. It seems almost impossible to not fall into the anachronistic trap of the egoism-altruism dilemma. But even when only applied to objects, tools, or horses, the phrase has a strong utilitarian ring to it, suggesting knowing how to utilize something, that is, how to use it for one's ulterior ends. Here it may be instructive to account for the fact that modern conceptions of use do not seamlessly correspond with the Greek chrestai. They are false friends. As has often been noted, the verb chrestai is semantically pluriform. In his seminal study, Redar lists 23 sens, so meanings, of ΧΡΗ, making the observation that the verb does not seem to have a proper meaning, but to acquire its meaning from its complements. So ΧΡΗ denotes states of affairs ranging from being in want of, to having, using, experiencing, and dealing with something. And applied to persons, the verb may denote to treat someone as, to be intimate with, or to have intercourse with someone. This range suggests a sense of usage that is broader than the purely pragmatic and instrumental sense, to make use of or to utilize. And one clue is in its morphosyntactical features. ΧΡΗ is, after all, not a purely transitive verb going with an object in the accusative case, but a medium tantum, going with a dative or genitive case, indicating a process that takes place in the subject, rather than processes that start from the subject and move beyond him. Similarly, Giorgio Agamben points out it is probable that precisely the subject-object relationship, so marked in the modern conception of the utilization of something on the part of someone, emerges as inadequate to grasp the meaning of the Greek verb. Agamben is particularly interested in the ancient Greek semantic field of ΧΡΗ vocabulary because in the verb ΧΡΗ he finds a relationality between subject and world that is differently structured than a subject-object relationship that is analytically so prevalent since Kant. So I follow Agamben and Redar in thinking that the semantic field implies a closeness or an interdependence of subject and object, possibly an adaptation or accommodation of both subject and object to the requirements of a given context. In any case, it seems safe to establish that ΧΡΗ-terminology is underdetermined in comparison with modern conceptions of utility and allows for discursive negotiation unknown to our concept of use. This protean quality of ΧΡΗ-terminology evidently did not escape the attention of 4th century native speakers themselves, most notably the Socratics. Now, going back to the notion of knowing how to use something, I would like to postulate that, and this may seem a stretch, that the underlying idea seems to be that using ΧΡΗ is not so much about a subject utilizing an object for their ulterior ends, but more about an adaptation or accommodation of a subject to an object. So not using a horse for some randomly chosen ulterior end, for instance, eating it, but using a horse properly, that is, using it for what it is meant for. It means being attuned to its ends. Now, if this is right, I'm not sure, but if this is right, this has implications for the anthropology of the Oeconomicus, because it suggests a rationality that is not strictly instrumental. Moving to my last point, it seems striking that in both the Oeconomicus and in the Eryxias, the topic of use is addressed by way of etymological reasoning. This is handout 11. That is, by the activating of an etymological connection between Khramatha, Chrysimos, and ΧΡΗ. This has, of course, not escaped scholarly attention. It led Wilhelm Nestle to suggest Prodicus, known for his orthotes onomaton, as a common source for both texts, and it led Aldo Brancacci to think of a connection with Antisthenes' chresis ton onomaton, the correct use of things, names, and judgments. What I would like to add here today is a consideration of the discursive function of the use of etymology. As Ineke Sluiter points out in her work on the ancient discursive practice of etymology, ancient etymologies are never motivated by historical interests. So the ancients are not interested in the systematic nature of language change, but they are synchronically oriented, establishing an interpretative relationship between words and their semantic explanation or definition. Ancient etymologies have certain recurring discourse characteristics. For one, they use the meta-language of causality, motivation, and explanation. They overtly explain why a name or a word is what it is by saying such and such is a significant name because. And they link what is well known, so the word form that is a starting point, to what is less well known, the semantic motivation of that word form. in a process that Fowler terms retrospective shaping. So the etymology is not so much a heuristic to find out what a word means, rather it provides an argumentative ground for a meaning that is already given. And the raison d'être of this language game was, in the end, the folk linguistic idea that an understanding of names implied an understanding of corresponding realities. Now, looking at the Socratic material on proper use, it is striking that such explicit markers of etymological discourse, of the kind that we find abundantly in the Cratylus, for instance, are almost lacking. So the only instances of meta-language are a few occurrences of the verb kaleo, on your handout number 11 and here on the slide. But what is clear is that the lexical connections between the words is clearly activated. So between Khramatha and Khrestai in the Oeconomicus, and between Khresimos, Khreia, Akhreia, Khramatha and Khrestai in the Eryxias, up to the point of overkill. So see the passage in the Eryxias with the climactic ta prostina Khreian Khresima Khrestai Khramatha estin. So although the argumentative function of these connections are not made explicit in neither of these texts, there clearly is an argumentative function to it. How does it work? Now here, the technique of retrospective shaping seems to be aimed not so much at explaining the less well-known by linking it to what is better known, rather activating the lexical connection between Khramatha and Khrestai serves to first defamiliarize the audience with the conventional meaning of Khramatha and then to reconstruct a normative meaning to it. The real meaning of Khramatha is something that the owner knows how to Khrestai. It suggests that to understand something about the proper use of things, we need to start with a proper use of words. So etymological reasoning seems to serve here as a means to ground normativity. So claims such as real use is, how we ought to use something is, in the order of things. So I hope to have, shown you at least why I am very excited and enthusiastic about working on this project on ancient economic thinking. I also hope to have made a case, made a plausible case for this research in which I would like to complement questions about economic concepts and principles with fundamental questions about anthropologies, so theories of human nature underlying these economic concepts, and knowledge practices that are used to shape these economic principles, such as the use of etymologies, eschatological discourse, or genetic discourse. Thank you so much for listening. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, I think that would be good. I'll give applause on behalf of all the muted people. Thank you very much for this. As those of you who've been to these before know, we handle questions by the raise your hand function, which you can find under reactions at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions or comments, please raise your hand and I will call on people. Sarah Brody.
Thank you very much for a wonderful, incredibly suggestive talk. Give one a great deal to think about for future work. My question is a sort of historical question, really, and that is, did anybody around these ancient discussions of value and possessions and so on raise the Mandeville problem? I mean, if you remember, Mandeville argued that a lot of useless luxuries are a good thing because it creates jobs. And I think that's something that we would still, many people today would agree with. And the only passage that I can think of that's remotely relevant to this, though it doesn't discuss it, is when in Book 2 of the Republic, Plato starts in on the simple city turning into the luxurious city. But of course, we can't expect him to be interested in the fact that once you have a lot of things like perfumes and gourmet foods and so forth, you're creating the possibility of jobs for a much larger, wider variety of people. So that's my question.
Well, thank you very much. This is really a wonderful question. I haven't thought of it before, and I must say that the suggestion that you made yourself about Republic 2 is also the only passage that I can think of. So this is really an interesting question that I will put on the agenda. It also reminds me of David Graeber's work on what. Well, this is the title of his work, so pardon my French, on bullshit jobs, which is actually also often used as an alternative solution to the question, how comes that Keynes' prediction did not come through? So while Skidelsky and Skidelsky focus on consumerism, David Graeber points to the emergence of more and more sophisticated jobs that actually do not serve any purpose. I very much like your suggestion to look at Republic 2 in this light, which obviously is an interesting passage. So I don't have a sophisticated answer yet, but I will think about it.
Okay, Emily.
Thank you for that really wonderful talk. It was extremely interesting and thought-provoking. I thought I'd just mention, as I'm sure you know, Oeconomicus is quite explicit about the point of, building up his wealth. And it's all about reverencing the gods, building up money so that you can spend freely on sacrifices. It's about helping your friends, of course, when they're in need, and it's about helping your city, also specifically beautifying the city. So I think there we have, again, the idea of beautiful structures for the gods, among other things. So I just wanted to maybe add that into the picture.
Yeah, it is actually a very relevant point when we talk about the ends of proper use, and this does chime in. This does well resonate with other things, other ideas that I have about the concept of proper use and what they are actually directed at in Xenophon's ethical work. So I think in Xenophon's work too, you see like what in anthropology they call the difference between two transactional orders. So the short-term order that is directed at individual gain, and the long-term order that is aimed at the reproduction of structures such as the city or the household. And what Xenophon usually does is redirect common sense economic concepts to make them serve the long-term order, whether that order is the household or an empire or anything that can be legitimately, in his eyes, viewed as a bigger order. So yeah, I think this is actually you're absolutely right to refer to this passage. Thank you very much.
Cedric Ayers.
Hi there. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this presentation. I'm a high school philosophy teacher in Brazil, so it's very important for us to make these kinds of events accessible for us who live so far away. Making it accessible is very important. I found it really interesting, your project about economics. I think it's great, but I would have three questions. The first two are interrelated, so I think it'd be all right to say them on a row. The first point is about the Homo economicus, the idea that you need a philosophical anthropology instructing economical thinking. I think that if we are to take economics as a science separate from other kinds of thinking, we have to delimit the scope of the phenomena we are observing. So in Aristotelian terms, right, we have to abstract it from the rest of other human aspects. In this sense, how could one study the economic phenomena if we mix so many aspects that make human beings at once? So in a sense, I think the greatest mistake is not to study economics through the lenses of Homo economicus, but to make the confusion of thinking that Homo economicus is humanity itself. I mean, there are other aspects going on, right? And so this goes to the topic which informs your
I normally announce this at the beginning, but I'd like to limit people to one question so that we can get through lots of questioners. I didn't announce that at the beginning today.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Let me just finish this point, which I think is intimately related then. The point is, if the end of economics is happiness, what's the difference between ethics and economics? Why would economics be something different from ethics? Thank you. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking a long time.
This is a great question. So I do see your point that it makes sense to delimit the scope of the phenomena that you are observing, but the point is that delimiting the scope also distorts what you get out of it. And well, at one point I mentioned that in our folk economic thinking, so I have to say economic theory has moved far beyond this Homo economicus, but it's still a lingering concept in our everyday folk understanding of how economics and how people work. So if we work with this concept, and if we are on a day-to-day basis approached in terms of this anthropology, it actually is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And let me give you one example. So one big problem is, so there is one big problem that every daycare center for babies and children always has to grapple with, and that is the fact that parents are always late in picking up their children. So in a couple of experiments, I think in Israel, in the Netherlands, and in the United States, independent experiments, some daycare centers decided to impose fines, a system of fines on parents who show up too late to pick up their children. This is actually working according to the principles of Homo economicus, because you well, you think in terms of incentive. You want to manipulate certain behaviors. Well, then you work with incentives, and a fine system is well, accords to this logic. Now, the funny thing is that parents did not show up earlier because of this fine system, because once this fine system was imposed, parents thought, oh, I'm going to be late picking up my baby. I'll pay this $5 or whatever it is. So it then starts to be incorporated within the instrumental logic of the parents. If you approach people like Homo economicus, they will behave as such. So other approaches actually work far better. For instance, there have also been experiments not with fines, but with mobilizing people's value. So when you come late for a certain meeting or picking up your kids, the organization will wire an amount of money, $10, for instance, to a, for instance, radical neo-Nazi foundation or something, and that clashes with your value system, and that is an incentive that works way better for people. So, well, maybe a bit of a convoluted example, but my point is that if people treat you like a Homo economicus, we start to behave like one, and I think it sounds innocent to delimit the scope of the phenomena you are observing, but you're actually actively shaping a world by doing so. This would be, in short, my answer to your question.
All right, Nick Smith.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting stuff. I wanted to ask a question about what you said with respect to the Euthydemus argument. As I recall, you said that that in the end, the kind of knowledge that seems to be in play here is sort of left unclear. What sort of knowledge would it be? whatever it is, it seems to be linked with the conception of happiness going on there too. And I guess what I wanted to do is suggest that there may be, it may be that there's no answer to that for a reason that Plato himself represents that kind of knowledge, at least in some places, as itself a real problem for us to have to think about, to need to think about. So what I really have in mind is your 10F on your handout, where you say that the notion of use really has to do with being attuned to the ends of whatever it is that you're using. I'm going to suggest that maybe what's going on is that the sort of knowledge that would involve proper use is going to also be applicable to the self. So self-knowledge would then be getting attuned to the ends of you, what it means to be a human being. And of course, Plato never gives us a very clear or well worked out answer to what self-knowledge would ultimately consist in. But I'm wondering if there's not some connection there, really thinking about the knowledge as being attuned to the ends of X, and recognizing that as something that is always problematized. It's always represented as something that we really need to work on, that nobody seems to have mastered at all.
Thank you. Wow, this is a very interesting suggestion, and one would expect, given the Socratic context, that this, application of correct use to oneself and to self-knowledge would occur in these Socratic texts. I'm trying to think of something that comes close to it. I don't find myself capable of it at this moment. Well, perhaps somebody in the audience. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There, it's mentioned in the Phaedrus as Socrates' preoccupation. That's why he's not particularly interested in trying to figure out the naturalistic basis for mythologies and so on. So
right.
Certainly it's mentioned often enough in Plato. I imagine others could help with other Socratic dialogue.
Well, thank you very much. This is great. Thank you.
Okay, David Constant.
Hi, Tazuko. One question that economics deals with, it doesn't seem to come up in your argument, is how you assess the relative value of things in exchange. That is to say, Aristotle asks the question of, how many pairs of shoes is a house worth? And you can get that from use value. Normally, use value in Marx's system plays a remarkably small role. All it means is that for something to have an exchange value, it must have some use. And beyond that, he has nothing to say about it. The occasions in which use value will affect the amount of money you're willing to pay is when you need something very desperately. But no theories of values, not the marginal theory of value, nor the labor theory of value, bring that up as an essential feature. It may well be one, but if you're going to bring use value in determining how exchange value is measured, that'd be one way to do it. But I'm surprised that you haven't looked for this element in trying to treat Xenophon as an economic, and Xenophon and Plato as economic thinkers.
Well, it is certainly an interesting topic. In my 2020 monograph, I devoted a chapter on this Aristotelian on Nicomachean Ethics 5.5. As you also know, that Scott Michael, for instance, has a very influential reading of this passage against the backdrop of Marxian notions of use value and exchange value. Well, when it comes to Xenophon, it is he does have some ideas about, well, not really about price formation, but I wouldn't also say that I don't think that the Nicomachean Ethics chapter is in the end about price formation. I think I agree with Gabriel Danzig on this, that it's about justifying that an exchange is actually fair rather than establishing a price. But Xenophon always gives this interesting twist towards use values. I don't think he is really preoccupied with, for instance, what Scott Michael calls the metaphysical chasm between use value and exchange value, as you may find in Aristotle.
Well, there's two different meanings here. Use value, I mean, we get closer to Cedric's point about this being a study of ethics rather than a study of economics.
But is that a problem? So the point, so I totally understand the question. Well, I mean, the final implication of objecting to the Homo economicus and to economics as it is as a science is, of course, that we cannot do the things that we are currently doing with economics as a science. We cannot make things measurable, predictable, etc., etc., because it becomes a totally different kind of discipline. So to just make my point clear, I'm not saying that we should quit doing economics. I'm saying that every system of economic thinking comes with an anthropology, and we always have to be very alert to it and be aware of the anthropological baggage that comes with it. One could also equally say that the anthropology of, like, the Socratic authors, as we have seen now, even though they seem to center around a Socrates famous for living a frugal and poor life, the values associated with it remain aristocratic values. I mean, it comes from a very privileged place to be talking about correct use, for instance, and about limiting one's consumption. That this is, it's almost like Thorsten Veblen's theory of the leisure class. So ancient economic thinking, as in the example that I showed today, too comes with a very particular anthropology. So in the end, I don't think I'm making a normative claim, but I'm interested in comparing the incommensurable and to see what the implications are of particular conceptual architectures.
All right, Alessandro Stavro.
Tazuko, thank you for your presentation. It was really very convincing. And my question goes to one point you made, which I found very interesting, when you said that reducing one needs means to be richer and entails more richness, and which I think you made the point when you talked about Oeconomicus to do. And you had this prosdeistai, where, of course, there is this need problem. And my question goes to the general problem of needs in Xenophon. When you have in Memorabilia very often enkrateia, which is the way you reduce the needs of your body. And there is one instance where enkrateia goes to money, which is 156 Memorabilia, where through enkrateia you reduce your need of money. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, did you think about a need connected to the general problem of enkrateia in Xenophon? Because if you connect it to enkrateia, then you have a lot of instances, and you don't need to use Eryxias, which, of course, I was very surprised in finding so much in Eryxias about this need problem, which you don't find in an explicit way in Memorabilia. You don't have any vocabulary of need. You have very much about place side and of minimum, of course. Mm-hmm. So, of course, you have the problem use, but is this use something you need? So this was my question. Did you think about it, about this possible connection?
Yeah, short answer, I did. And I actually also elaborated a bit on it in my book. So today I wanted to restrict the discussion on the concept of of proper use as we find it in the first chapter of the Oeconomicus. And there, well, so, I mean, looking at it from this restricted angle, while having looked at this passage so many times before, for the first time, I, for instance, noticed that the adjective chresimos doesn't occur in Oeconomicus 1:1, whereas it would have been like a perfect, argumentatively, it would have fitted perfectly in the flow of in the flow of argument. And similarly, one would have expected a relation between the concept of correct use and limiting one's needs. And there is a bit of a bridging going on when Socrates starts to talk about slavery of the soul. So this seems to conceptually connect the two themes. But what struck me for the particular argument I was making today was that there was no systematic relationship carved out in this section of the Oeconomicus. Beyond that, of course, in Xenophon's Socratic works, and also beyond, there is a very tight relation between the notion of enkrateia and limiting one's needs. And yeah, so yeah, thank you for your point. And there certainly is this conceptual relationship. Yeah.
Okay, Sarah Brody.
Yes. Okay. My comment is simply that this discussion about use and usefulness brings out how clever the hedonism of Callicles is in this context, because if ultimately what we seek is either just, as it were, straightforward pleasure, or the special kind of pleasure and excitement that comes with, is supposed to come with desire satisfaction, it seems to me that even in ancient Greek, ΧΡΗ, we cannot use pleasure. So that the whole dialectic about something is not worth anything unless we know how to use it, right? Like your nice example of the horse. Mm-hmm. Well, in the case of pleasure, there seems somehow, I mean, there may be lots of problems about pleasure, but there doesn't seem to be a problem about how to use pleasure.
Well,
so
isn't it possible to construct ΧΡΗ with aphrodisium, so sexual pleasures? I think this is what Michel Foucault gets the use of pleasures, the title of the second volume of Histoire de Sexualité. Excuse me. So I think it is possible to construct the verb with aphrodisia, maybe also with epithemion. Well, but yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but yeah.
I mean, with all respect to Foucault, I mean, the word aphrodisia does not immediately mean pleasure. It implies it, as it were, non-semantically has the implicature that these are things that are mostly sought because they give pleasure. But I was just thinking of in a more austere way, I think, that it would be highly unnatural to speak of ΧΡΗ hedone, and that seems to be of some philosophical interest, actually.
Yeah,
that's all.
I haven't seen the collocation, but after this meeting, I will immediately look it up. It's yeah, thank you.
Dan Graham.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I want to bring up again something we've talked around certainly a number of times, but just the point that it seems likely that if one were going to take a Socratic position on economics seriously, it would end up being, again, as certainly has been suggested already, but it would end up being something like, the economics would end up being something like a department of ethics. And the focus would be, of course, not about measurement and so forth, but about the good life, where the good life is going to include at least a strong component of morality, ethics, and so on. And I guess a couple of thoughts on this. Well, one would be the most obvious point here is that seems fairly incompatible, fairly incommensurable with modern economics. But the other point would be maybe contemporary economics needs a little bit more of this stuff, in the sense that if we're going to save the planet, we can't just think about how much we're going to spend and how much we're going to waste and, you know, consume. There's got to be some endpoint here that's a little bit beyond that. And if economics can't figure it out, then what good is economics?
Well, thank you. I think I think Kate Rayworth would totally agree with you. So one of the fun things of donut economics is that she actually also quotes Xenophon's Oeconomicus 1:1 quite extensively in her book, so there are a couple of high-profile economic thinkers nowadays who are trying to steer economics away from well, the neoclassical approach, and especially the Lionel Robbins like a definition of economics. So Kate Rayworth actually also makes quite a point out of that, and steer it into a direction where economics actually serves other bigger purposes, such as the sustainability of our planet. So Kate Rayworth is a great example of that. But they are, I think, well, the Skidelsky's also try to make a case for a more happiness-based way, a conception of economics. So I think many initiatives are actually also being taken. So there are international collectives of economic students who advocate for revision of economics education at the Ivy League universities, for instance, and other higher education institutions, and they all point towards the same direction, that something goes wrong when you fundamentally separate economics from all ethical concerns. At the same time, it's also really hard to imagine what an ethically oriented economic science would look like. And one of the major problems that we have with it is that we would make the problem of the summum bonum and the good life, these problems would become economic questions again, which means that we have to be capable of conducting a public conversation about it. And this is very, very difficult, especially in those parts of the world where we are really ingrained with a particular notion of freedom, which holds that thinking about ends is a private matter, and that others should not interfere with what we regard as the highest good. So it's not easy to think of a way to do this, but I think there is momentum right now for this.
Gabriel Danzig has wanted to ask a question for a while, but had trouble with the raise your hand function. Gabriel, would you like to make your comment or ask your question?
Oh, Gabriel, you're on mute.
Gabriel?
Maybe I was better on mute, but I just wanted to follow up on what Cedric started with, this merging of ethics and economics, which I think is really right. And what's surprising to me, really, in the modern university, is that we don't have a conception that the sciences should even agree with each other. I mean, I think they still have that in the natural sciences, but you can go to a course on economics, which will completely disagree with what you could learn in a course on ethics. And I think that to the Socratic thinkers, and Aristotle, Plato, would all say that would disprove, one of them at least, that you'd have to have consistency between things if they're going to be sciences. So I think that this is really correct and the right way to think about it. Let's leave it with that comment.
I'm afraid, Gabriel, if you would point this out to an economist, this would actually be an ammunition to them that the ethicists are wrong and the ethics is not a science. But I think yeah, this is a very important point, that there seems to be no consilience at all between particular branches of economic science and, for instance, other sciences on human behavior, for instance. So yeah, I think this call to consilience is something to take very seriously. Thank you.
One last question. I'm sorry, I'm not going to get the pronunciation of your name right. Sergius?
You did get it right. Thank you very much. I'm Sergiusz Kaźmierski. I'm from the University of Regensburg, Germany, and a classical philologist here. And I apologize for my bad English. I've been working on different projects on what we call the hospitable economy with researchers from the University of Bolzano in Italy for the last 10 years. And we came to nearly the same conclusions as you came to, that we cannot talk about ancient economics without locating it within ethics, first of all, and without posing the question what the human being is, what human being is. So in Aristotle's definition, or in Aristotle's economics, it is not surprising that in Aristotle's economics, in the first book of the Politics, the definition of the human being is put first, and afterwards he develops his economics. And my question would be, you agree, as far as I understood from your talk, you agree with this procedure to develop true economics. But my question is, in how far can we talk about the usefulness or the proper use of things at all if we don't have an answer to the question who that being is that we call human? So is it possible to develop an entire economics without answering the question about the logos, which is the deepest entity within the definition of the human being? I don't know if I made myself clear. So thank you very much.
So thank you also for talking about this very interesting project that you've been engaged in. So I would really love to know more about this. So I'm going to Google you after this meeting. For one thing, so this is a fundamental question, and I'm trying to think of a good way to approach it. So my argument is that any economic theory implies a particular anthropology, and that it helps to be aware of it because, well, it steers, for instance, a particular it steers argumentation in a particular direction, for instance, and it imports all kinds of presuppositions into the discussion. any type of economic theory will do that. So not only the neoclassical type, but also social economics, which has a different anthropology at its center, human being as a social being, vulnerable for all kinds of forces of, for instance, peer pressure. So my project is basically about exposing this, and maybe not directly about thinking of an alternative economic theory. So my pretenses are, I think, just like the pretenses of modern economics, purely descriptive in nature. But I am, of course, interested in projects that that aim to revise our thinking of economic behavior, and yeah, I'm certainly interested in that, but it's not the core of my, well, it's not my own aspiration, let me put it this way. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yes, you did in a way, because yes, you did, but it is for me not. I've been working on the Aristotelian economics for some years now, and I came to that finishing point right now, that that the question what the human being is in itself an economical question within the Aristotelian thinking. But economics in this sense is not economics in the sense that we understand it today,
Yeah,
as you made entirely clear in your talk. It's I see many connections, but our project, or my point of view on the ancient economics, is to not only to amend or to develop the classical philological research on that topic, but to maybe pose the right question to develop economics itself. So okay, I already talked too much, and I apologize for this.
I find this
past time, so I'd like to release everyone. Let's thank our speaker, and I hope to see as many of you as possible in 2 weeks at our next virtual Socrates colloquium. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.